Welcome to the Frontline Club and to this room, which is acquiring increasing reputation for extraordinary timeliness. So on the day when Condoleezza Rice announces that the quartet will be meeting in Berlin in a few days' time, on the day when an Israeli minister announces airily that a final settlement can be expected within 2 years, 6 months discussion of general principles, 18 months discussion of the details, and then all will be settled. And on such a day, Frontline Club has arranged this important discussion of Palestinian politics. Whether you think these latest American and Israeli moves represent a genuine change or a genuine opportunity, or whether you think that they lack substance and, as in the past, are unlikely to lead anywhere, one thing is clear. This is a time of exceptional danger and difficulty for the Palestinian people. If this is a real opportunity, they need to be united in order to seize it. If it's another attempt to divert Palestinian energies or to exploit Palestinian divisions, they need to be perhaps in pursuit on the American side of some kind of cover for their new policies vis-à-vis Iraq and Iran. If it's that, then they need to be united to resist it. So it's in that kind of context that we are looking at the issues of internal Palestinian politics tonight. My name is Martin Woolacott. I worked for The Guardian for many years. I was foreign correspondent and foreign editor and then a foreign commentator. I still do occasional leader writing work and occasional blogging for The Guardian. My own experience with the Middle East, I did work there, is now quite a long way in the past. That's occasionally an advantage. But in any case, this panel has absolutely up-to-date experience of the region and an up-to-date grasp of what is a very complex situation. I will introduce our four panelists, and then I'll explain how I propose to organize a discussion in three rough groupings and then on to questions from the audience. First of all, I'll introduce Rada first. Her work, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. She's a doctor and a long-time activist, an academic also. She has written one of the 2 or 3 best Palestinian memoirs, In Search of Fatima. It's also a beautiful memoir of British life as well. She has a new book coming out later in the year called Married to Another Man, a title she may or may not explain, about the broad issues of Palestinian politics, Palestine and Israel. I'll introduce next Azzam Tamimi. Tamimi, sorry. He has a formidable reputation as an articulate, effective and tough spokesman for Hamas and its policies. And then David Pratt, who is the foreign editor of the Sunday Herald in Scotland, and also a goodly portion of its foreign staff, travelling widely. He's worked in trouble spots around the world, the Middle East very much included, but also the Balkans and Africa. He too has a new book, which I tried to buy in preparation for this evening. Was unable to locate a copy in London, but I seem to have overlooked this particular source, so I'll be able to get one afterwards. But that's David. And then finally, Azzam Zamlot, who is the political counselor of the delegation here. Sorry about the mic. Please warn me when I let it drop. Of the Palestinian delegation here, an economist by trade, and he's been at the delegation since 2003. So now how should we organize the discussion? I propose to do it in 3 chunks. Chunk number 1 is to examine the general differences over broad strategy between Fatah and Hamas. Chunk number 2 is to look at what looks large in the eyes of the West, and I think less large in the eyes of people in Palestine itself, which is the difference between a movement generally seen, at least from outside, as religious, and a movement generally seen, at least from outside, as secular in its principles. And finally, this I expect will be the largest portion of our discussion, to ask our panelists to talk about their interpretation of recent events, i.e. the events which can be taken back to Abu Mazen's decision to announce plans, or at least to propose, or some would say to threaten, to call new elections, all the way through the last 6 or 7 weeks of distressing events, bloody fighting, not the first fighting, but some of the worst fighting between the 2 groups. And of course, interspersed with that, reconciliation, discussion, attempts to resolve differences. Where is that going? What is nature in this final session of what's the role of outsiders? What are the Americans and Israelis doing? What are the Egyptians doing? What are the Iranians doing? How that is seen from these different perspectives represented by our panelists here. So we begin with the first section, which is a broad difference of strategy, and I'll throw this in just to start things off. I suppose it would be generally accepted that Fatah and the PLO have seen in recent years that the way to secure a Palestinian state worthy of the name has been to enlist the international community, Europe, and of course particularly America, and to rely on these outsiders to help deliver the desired outcome. And then, to sum it up very succinctly, that the road to a state lies through Washington. So the Hamas position has been skeptical of that, has felt that has been proved to be not successful, and that the right way to deal with the Israelis is to face them with an unrelenting, a stern, and hard and continuingly hard attitude to the point where the Israelis learn a degree of respect for their Palestinian opponent and possible partner. And it's this idea of achieving respect as a way to the state, on the one hand, and enlisting the goodwill and the peaceful hopes of the international community on the other, which represents the area of difference, in my view. But panelists may differ with me. I'm going to ask David to begin by commenting on that.
Well, I think the whole question of strategy, it strikes me at the moment that the strategy of both Fatah and Hamas is at the moment really one not simply of self-preservation, but of obviously trying to gain the upper hand. I mean, it's the idea that there's some sort of strategy, long-term strategy there at the moment, I think is rather misleading. I'm sure the other panelists here will tell us a bit more about that. We know about the background, we know about the differences between the 2 groups, the secular, the Islamist. We know the strategies that they've employed militarily, politically, both regionally, internationally, and wherever. But it strikes me that we're in a certain sort of timescale at the moment whereby both sections, both Fatah and Hamas, are utterly preoccupied with their own dominance, with their own sort of, if you like, sort of attempt to become superior, to actually win through in the end at the moment. I don't really see both groups having a wider strategy. Much has been made of the fact that Fatah have now become shall we say, closer to Washington, to the United States. There are certain deals which I'm sure we will talk about later on, perhaps in your third chunk, as you mentioned earlier, Martin. And indeed, Hamas's continued allegiance, association, and dialogue with Iran. Strategy-wise, I feel that both are rather boxed into a corner at the moment. I mean, ever since that day when Hamas won the election, and Saeb Erekat spoke about how, we woke up this morning and I think he said something like the sky was a different colour. It was a radical change at that particular moment. Since then, as we know, they've found themselves rather beleaguered, politically hemmed in, both externally and internally by the machinations of Hamas itself. I think there's another thing too which is important, is the sort of geographical difference between the two groups. I'm always struck by this whenever I visit the occupied territories or Gaza, the way in which the internal dynamics of Gaza are similar but very different in many ways from what happens in the West Bank itself. Longer-term strategy, I think at the moment it's a battle for superiority, quite simply in that sense. The microphone should be working? Yeah. I think the most worrying aspect of all of this is really the way in which the Palestinian people themselves potentially stand to lose out of this battle. I would loathe, as I'm sure many people here would, to see both sides being drawn into some internecine battle even more than they are at the moment.
Yeah. David, that's a picture in which you think the real momentum here is a kind of institutional or tribal division, and one side or the other is seeking precedence and dominance. It rather downgrades the idea that there are real differences of principle between the two movements, whatever you think about those differences. Let me move to Rada and ask her, what is her picture? Is it one of just a struggle between two groups that happen to be, as it were, have grown up and are there and have their own structures of patronage and control and are therefore at odds? Or are we talking about two movements which have serious and important differences of principle and tactics?
Well, actually, I think both of those are true. I don't actually see this as just simply a power struggle. There is a power struggle now, but that power struggle has been created largely by external interference in Palestinian affairs. It's important to remember that these two movements are both nationalist movements. They are patriotic movements. We mustn't forget that. They both are aiming at the same thing: Palestinian independence, self-determination. Although their vision of how they arrive at it, how the Palestinians will arrive at that, are different. Fatah is the much older movement. It's the one that started its life believing in the importance of the armed struggle. Hamas was a latecomer onto this scene. It really came to prominence in 1989. So there is that to bear in mind. Now, of course, there are also divergent visions of how to arrive at the same endpoint. By that I mean that Hamas obviously has a vision which is tied to Islam, in which there is a future in which ultimately one day there would be an Islamic state over the whole land of Palestine, not just the West Bank, etc. But what is not often realized is that Hamas is very flexible and has, in recent years, if you read what they're writing, if you listen to what they say, has moved towards an acceptance of a two-state position ever since the days of Ahmad Yassin, their spiritual leader, who was assassinated by the Israelis. They have moved to a position of saying we accept a two-state solution, although ultimately the vision remains something much more than just this state. clearly, the tragedy, I think, is that these differences in strategy, the Fatah, for example, having started life believing in diplomacy and the armed struggle, has abandoned the armed struggle effectively and is only exploring the diplomatic channel, which of course has been completely disastrous because you see what it's led to, etc. I won't go on for too long, but I just wanted to say that the tragedy, I think, is that this is not so much really about fundamental differences between the two groups, political differences, but because of the effect of the sanctions and the siege and the assault on the properly elected Hamas government, that we have all sorts of other imperatives coming in, starving people, no salaries, all the rest, which have muddied the picture completely.
Vera, thank you very much. Azzam, a struggle over power or a struggle over principle, or something of both?
There is a struggle for power, but it's not from Hamas' side. The struggle for power is from the side of a minority group within Fatah who are so influential and who, during the time when Fatah was in charge, became established in power, financial as well as military, political. And they are the ones who were rather disappointed at the result of the election. But this struggle for power by this group, one of the most prominent figures of this group is Mohammed Ahlan, for instance, could not have continued for this long and could not have brought about such internal feud had there not been a very negative international community position, and I agree here with Ghada, because the response of the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and various other allies internationally as well as regionally was to punish the Palestinians for what they did, choosing Hamas in the elections. And since then, we've seen one campaign after the other in order to force the failure upon a Hamas-formed government. Although Hamas in the beginning wanted everybody to be involved. The idea of a national unity government was a Hamas idea.
But Azzam, can I interrupt a bit and say that's fine and it's illuminating, but can you talk a little to the point of what are the differences of principle? I understand the point you're making about an established elite that is
You asked me
worried
about whether
its future.
it was a struggle or not. I'm answering your question.
Well, you answered the first part. Maybe I can push you on to the second part,
Okay.
the part which is about genuine differences of principle.
Well, Hamas and Fatah came out of the same womb, and that is the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine. Hamas today believes in exactly the same things that Fatah believed in when it was born in 1957 in Kuwait. Because of various factors, Fatah decided to settle for part of what it initially wanted to struggle for, and it convinced itself and sought to convince the Palestinian people that there was going to be no solution until we recognized the right of Israel to exist in exchange of a state next to it. Hamas refuses to accept this because, as far as Hamas is concerned, Israel is an illegitimate entity created in Palestine by the world powers for colonial purposes, and what is wrong can never be right. But recognizing that the balance of power is not in its favor, Hamas has settled for something less as well. But that less thing does not include recognizing the legitimacy of the State of Israel, but offering to live next to Israel as part of a long-term truce. So this would be the main difference.
Thank you. Azzam, can you speak to these issues?
I'll try. First of all, let me make absolutely sure that the delegation is the PLO office in London, the diplomatic mission, and in that sense I talk and speak on behalf of all Palestinians. I do not represent a specific party. Having said that, I am made to, in a way or another, represent the nationalists in this very particular platform, and I will happily do so, but for the sake of the argument.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
Having said that, no, I don't see this as a power struggle. I disagree there. There is no much power into the Palestinian Authority. In January, when the elections were conducted, already our treasury was bankrupt. And you all are very well aware of the powers attained or attributed to the authority. I think I see it rather as a struggle of two different approaches within the Palestinian society rather than vis-à-vis Israel. We have no strategic difference between Fatah and Hamas vis-à-vis Israel. Both parties do call for, in a way or another, the establishment of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and East Jerusalem being the capital, and both parties call for a just solution for the issue of refugees. Where we differ, or where Fatah and Hamas differ, is how do you deal with the Palestinian society. I again agree that Fatah started as a Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, while there were a group of Fatah, like Yasser Arafat, certainly Abu Jihad, Al-Wazir, another one, who had Brotherhood tendency. Fatah has always focused on the national identity and the national character of the Palestinian individual and person and cause for that matter. And therefore, the materialization of our national identity is the most important in our political aspirations. While Hamas might have more of a religious identity, having in Palestine we have the two identities existing at the same time. We have the nationalist and we have the religious. And therefore, while Fatah is playing much more on the nationalist, Hamas is playing on the religious part. But I have heard some comments on Fatah believing that the road to Jerusalem is through Washington, and Fatah being closer to Washington. No, this is not Fatah. This is so not Fatah. Let me give you one little example. According to the Israeli Ministry of Defense, up until 2005, there were around 1,000 Israeli killed. 464 were killed by Fatah. 421 were killed by Hamas. This isn't about who's putting the fight or who's making the occupation less comfortable or more comfortable. This is about a school of thought within the PLO and the Palestinian National Movement that has believed at one certain point in time that perhaps it is time, having been through armed struggle throughout the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, having fought in Jordan, in Beirut, and elsewhere, having been the forefront and the front line of national armed struggle, it's time to perhaps give negotiations a chance. It's that school of thought that was defeated. And it was not defeated by its own, it was defeated by the US and Israel. It is Israel that defeated that school of thought. And that school of thought, that group, is not only Fatah. You have Yasser Abed Rabbo, who is not Fatah whatsoever, and who is in the lead of this school of thought. On the other hand, you have people like Marwan al-Barghouthi, who has got nothing whatsoever with this school of thought. So let's set the record very clear here. This isn't Fatah in any way or another. Fatah remains to be a mass movement that represents the Palestinian national identity. And I think Fatah was vetoed out or voted out for that very particular reason. I think the Palestinian people, rightly so, have delivered a verdict on the failed peace process. They have come to the conclusion that this is the time when we actually start indicting. We indict Fatah for all these empty promises. We indict Israel for all these expansions and irresponsible humiliations. We indict the US for this biasness. And first and foremost, we are delivering a message that negotiations is not our only option. This isn't Fatah. This was about that particular school of thought.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, differences there, unresolved. Let's move on and see whether we can find a central ground in the next discussion, which has been touched on in some of the remarks. The vision of the Palestinian future, leaving aside where the Israeli state will or might not be in such a future within the Palestinian state. What kind of future? Is the stereotype division between a view of Hamas as a religious movement and the view of Fatah as a secular movement, does it have any grounding in reality? How secular is Fatah? How religious is Hamas? How much does Hamas reject the Western template of society? And how much does Fatah embrace an essentially Western idea of what kind of state it would want to have at the end of this road, if the end of this road is reached? I'll begin with Rada, if I may.
Well, I find it difficult to answer these questions in the way that you would like, which I understand they're very, very good questions. The reason is I am so kind of depressed by the realization that, in fact, the Palestinians as a whole have been forced into positions of polarization which are really not natural in Palestinian society. And that has happened because of the stereotyping that goes on from the West, by Israel, by the Western part. Absolutely. Yeah. That in fact, you're absolutely right. That it does not represent the true picture. And in a sense, the Palestinians are really, it's very sad that they're forced to adopt positions. That often happens, when somebody labels you as something, you start to behave in a way which fulfills that label, although it's actually not the real situation. Fatah is are a people composed of a majority of people, as indeed are the Palestinians, who are Muslims. And they are often quite devout. We're not talking about fundamentalism. These are devout Muslims. And therefore, in that sense, Hamas, which professes a frankly religious ideology in some sense, they're not that different. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the Palestinian people as a whole tend to be more secular in their political outlook than religious. Whether privately they are believing Muslims, that's another matter. But the question of introducing religion into politics is not something that has been a Palestinian trait. It's a much more recent development. And I've often thought, actually, it is linked to the creation of Israel. I mean, it may surprise people here to think that the trend towards the greater religious fundamentalism, religiosity, all these sorts of things are linked to the climate created by a state which is created on a religious definition. In other words, it makes that idea that you can be defined first as a member of a religious rather than a national community becomes acceptable, because Israel is indeed based on a religious definition. And therefore these Islamist movements have grown. Now, you asked me something else which I have now forgotten.
I think...
Or maybe I've said enough.
I think we'll move on. And perhaps I can ask David, in the elections which brought the Hamas government to power, it seems from polling afterwards, and I know polls can be disputed and so on, that when Palestinians were asked why they voted for Hamas, the principal reason, the dominating reason, was good government. They wanted efficient and uncorrupt government. They didn't vote that much for these strategic questions we discussed in the first section as to how things had gone with Israel and the United States. They wanted negotiations to continue. They voted for good government, and they didn't particularly vote for a religious or secular sort of idea of Palestine. That's my understanding of what we know about the elections. So what does that tell us about the secular-religious divide, if it exists, in Palestinian politics?
I think actually the Palestinian people voted for Hamas for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, you've touched on one of them yourself, which is obviously a history of Fatah, of corruption, of an old generation. I think we're familiar with that nothing had changed. They felt themselves in a terrible impasse. You know, they needed change in that sense. There are other dimensions to this as well. I think there's almost been too much made of the idea that it was somehow a sort of vote of objection against Fatah, against the old guard. There were other reasons. They felt, I think, that Hamas could shake things up, could make a difference in that way. I think it's interesting particularly, you asked me this question, but I've just been listening to the panel here talking about how the Palestinian movement is all from the same womb. It has the same objectives to a great extent. And I'm encouraged to hear that. I think most of us would be pleased to hear that, and I'm sure Palestinians in the occupied territories in Gaza would be pleased to hear that. It's also an understandable take on the situation from the panel for that reason. The reality, though, I think as a reporter when I've been there, and perhaps I'm in a position to comment on this in a way perhaps without the sort of political constraints perhaps that my fellow panellists have on them, is that the reality on the ground is far from that. I mean, the theme of tonight's discussion is the internal battle. On the streets of Gaza and elsewhere, people are killing each other. If there is so much in common at the moment, why are both groups at loggerheads continuously? Why are militias, security groups, movements being bolstered by external forces? Why indeed are the leaders of both Fatah and Hamas searching out, seeking out this patronage that you're talking about, seeking out weapons, seeking out training, reinforcing their respective positions militarily and politically? Now, that is a reality on the ground, and I think any observer, any reporter recognises that. It's very easy, I think, to get into this notion of stereotyping and, you know, that somehow the West is entirely to blame for this. It's less easy, I think, or it's important to recognise that the Palestinians themselves, both Fatah and Hamas, are bringing many of the problems that are facing them on themselves. Okay. Let's face this reality. Ultimately, the occupation is to blame, but they are encouraging and fanning the flames themselves also.
Okay, David, thanks very much. Azzam, one thing as David's made clear, one thing the Palestinians didn't vote for was 10 months of standoff between the two main groupings, 10 months of no government or ineffective government for all kinds of reasons, and certainly not for gun battles in the streets taking the lives of Palestinian civilians. It's bad enough when civilians go down under Israeli fire. To have them go down under Palestinian fire is truly appalling. What's your answer to the reason? What is the reason that this has happened? And what do you say to David's argument that this crisis has been brought on the Palestinians to some considerable extent, not entirely, but to some considerable extent, by themselves?
First of all, infighting is the worst that can happen to the Palestinian cause. Nothing is more damaging to us than what happened. Luckily, these things have been sporadic. And they have been sporadic, and I can assure you one thing, it will not break into an all-out civil war for the reasons that Ghada just mentioned. This is a society that is not sectarian, that its division is rather strategic, it's not religious, it is not based on, and there is a great deal of tolerance. I think our social net will always protect us from going that far. Having said that, these very unfortunate, regrettable incidents that have been taking place sporadically the last few months are indeed the results of some internal failure, and some external intervention, some external spoilers. And I would give, out of scale from 1 to 10, I would give the external scale, sorry David, at least 8 out of 10, at least. Now, having said that, let us remember that Fatah was the first national movement in the history of that region that not only conducted free, transparent, and democratic elections, but actually handed in power. It didn't happen in Egypt. It didn't happen in Algeria. It didn't happen in Libya. It didn't happen anywhere. Now this is something we have to salute and remember. Second, when Hamas decided to run the elections, it was a historical opportunity. Because all of a sudden, you have at the helm of the Palestinian National Authority a president who is called by Washington a man of peace, who is the moderate of moderates, and who has a vision and a passion towards negotiations and towards dialogue. And you have within the authority Hamas, who has been always outside the process, who has been always opposing the process. And by the definition, once they accepted and they ran the elections, they opted for political means. And I have studied some conflict resolution. When a party opts for political means, this is something to be welcomed. Absolutely welcome. It wasn't. In fact, it was external spoilers that has pushed all of us to this corner of 80% poverty. A corner where you perceive yourself in a very narrow sense. It is the Syrian-Iranian side of things, and it is Washington-Tel Aviv side of things that have been so polarizing us to the extent that the entire nation was besieged, absolutely besieged, because apparently Washington has a decision not to make any experience that involves Islamic movement succeed at the expense of us Palestinians. I think the entire Palestinian lot was extremely keen to have the election experience succeed.
Okay. Azzam, why was this opportunity, some describes, this dream team, if you like, why did it dissipate in the way it did? Was it external forces? What did the responsibility belong to the parties within Palestine itself? Why couldn't, if there were external forces, why couldn't they be jointly resisted or outmaneuvered? What's happened over the last 10 months?
Well, I did mention some of, I did allude to this in my answer earlier, and very briefly. There is a gang within Fatah who doesn't want this government to work, and they are fully supported by the Americans. And any talk about a Syrian-Iranian role in this is a lie, is simply unfounded. Iran and Syria have no influence whatsoever in this process. It's this same gang that is working and is being funded by the United States of America and Britain that is propagating this nonsense in order to divert attention from the real issue. The real issue is that we've had an election, and Mahmoud Abbas had the credit of allowing the election to proceed, but then from within his own movement, there are people who wanted to make sure that those who were elected to power would never be able to run a government. It's as simple as that.
But why couldn't there be a national unity government?
Hamas initially asked everybody, every single faction, prior to forming its own government, to come and join in. And there were a series of conditions, crippling conditions. Everybody knew Hamas would never agree to them. Yeah. One of them, for instance, that they have to recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. According to the March 2005 meeting in Cairo, that was going to happen after the PLO was reformed and reconstructed. And that process was stalled or halted. Yeah. Then there were other conditions, like you have to recognize international legitimacy. You have to do this, you have to do that. Of course, it's impossible. And that's why it will never work. It will never work if they keep asking Hamas to do what Hamas can never do.
Martin, I just need to add to that what Azzam said. There was, in fact, intimidation, Azzam, I'm sure you know this, at the time that Hamas invited all the other groups to join the government. They were intimidated by the Americans from joining. I know that for an absolute fact. And this, of course, discouraged anybody from making that government a national unity government. That's very
Actually, they were told they would be put on the terrorism list.
That's right.
There were some Fatah figures who wanted to join the Hamas government, but they were threatened.
Well, that brings us to the last chunk, which is obviously related to some of the things that we've just been saying. And, what of the last 6 weeks? What are the events of the last 6 weeks? What do they mean? What has been going on? What do we make of the move by Abu Mazen to call elections? What do we make of the supply of arms to presidential guard and other and the money that's coming in? What do we make of the moves by the United States, the recent trip by Condoleezza Rice? What is going on? Is it just the drama of which Azzam spoke writ large in a new staging, or do we find any shred of hope that possibly in these movements there might be some genuine opportunity that Palestinians, united Palestinians, could seize, perhaps against the grain of what the Americans want to do, and certainly against the grain of what the Israelis want to do? We see where the Israelis are. They are left without a strategy after the Lebanon war of this last summer. They have nothing in the strategic cupboard at all, and so they need something else, but they don't want, of course, to pay any sort of serious price for it. Is there not a way of turning this round? So I'll begin again and ask you all. 6 weeks, many moves, many political switches and changes, both in Palestine and outside, culminating in this effort to get a sort of, quote, peace process, unquote, going again. Bloody fighting. I know it's intermittent. I know it could be worse, but nevertheless, bloody fighting. What are we to make of it? Where is it going? Sam, I'll begin with you.
It's exactly what I was saying, that Ghada and Azzam alluded to, the external factor. And yes, indeed, there was some intimidation by Washington for some Fatah groups to join the government. And I do believe personally that there is some great deal of influence by some regional power. And this is the conclusion. The conclusion is that forming a Palestinian national unity government is being delayed not because of internal factors, but because of external intervention and interference. I am extremely optimistic, and I haven't been for the last 8 months, that forming a national unity government is very near. And it is very near because the Palestinian internal scene, there is an overwhelming popular demand from Palestinians to form such a government. And under all circumstances, leaders of both divide would have to listen to such unprecedented pressure from the streets right across the board. And I really want to say this. Another reason why I am not very worried about an all-out, or it can get worse, is the ugliness of the occupation and the ugliness of our reality. I do think that the coming few months would witness some serious Israeli, unfortunately, I expect some serious Israeli aggressions for the vacuum that is existing now, especially after the Lebanon war. And if that happens, that will be again a unifying factor. Throughout the second Intifada, I think Fatah and Hamas was working in partnership, in resistance and in political arenas. And I think the last few months have been extremely unfortunate. But luckily, I see no other venue in the future, no other venue. And again, distinguishing between that school of thought and Fatah as Fatah, but actually to work very closely, given the circumstances, with Hamas to try and find a way out of this.
Azzam, you wrote for The Guardian some time ago a piece which was entitled, and that certainly was the burden of the piece, Another Bid to Break Hamas. That's what you thought a few weeks ago. Given a rather optimistic and reaching out nature of Azzam's answer there, do you still think so?
I think there is this group that I alluded to within Fatah that is determined to spoil it for all of us. But there are others within Fatah who are pulling Mahmoud Abbas in the other direction and telling him it cannot continue to go this. And that's why we saw something very, very positive just before Rice came to the region, when it was agreed to call off the strike, for instance, and it was agreed. There was some talk about forming a national unity government and about the allocations of the various portfolios, etc. But then there was a setback when it was reported that Mahmoud Dahlan had promised Ehud Olmert that if he did not go ahead with the swap of prisoners with Hamas, he would guarantee him the safe return of Shalit within 2 months. And that brought, or that has so far spoiled a deal that was imminent. The Egyptians are saying there was almost a deal there. Now there is something positive again today. We heard that Mahmoud Abbas is going to Damascus on Saturday, and that there is this possibility that he might meet Khalid Mash'al.
Surely.
So
it surely will.
We don't. It's not confirmed. It hasn't been confirmed by either side. But let's hope they do, because if they do meet, I'm sure something very good will come out of it.
Good. David, optimism?
Well, it's encouraging again to hear optimistic voices here. And I suspect there are lots of dynamics and machinations going on behind the scene, which I'm not party to, and I'm sure most of the audience are completely unaware of. And perhaps on the basis of that, there are reasons to be optimistic. And I do sense, though, there's a lot of hedging of bets going on here. You know, that despite the talking that's going on, the dialogue behind the scenes, or publicly for that matter, talks of a unity government, attempts to diffuse the internecine fighting that's going on, I also suspect, and indeed I'm pretty certain, that both Fatah and Hamas are also working hard behind the scenes to ensure that should it come to some kind of military confrontation, that they are equipped to handle that situation. And I would be interested to hear from my fellow panelists here tonight a little bit more detail about that. I mean, we've had references to Mohammed Dahlan and the sort of deals that Dahlan has been doing with the Americans, perhaps. I'm also interested to hear a little bit more about how Fatah and how Abu Mazen has allegedly been in receipt of training. Some of his sections have been received training by American personnel. The arms shipments have come in to bolster to Fatah. I'm keen to hear a bit more about that. I know the dialogue is ongoing, but I sense simultaneously there are efforts to reinforce themselves militarily, and that remains very worrying.
Okay. Well, I think at this stage we won't raise those military questions. They were mentioned earlier. The arms are coming in. If you wish to respond to that, we certainly had very substantial reports that arms have come in from Egypt, that there's training going on, and that there is a definite arming up. Possibly
$86 million to Mahmoud Abbas from the Americans.
I just want to throw this to the audience. If America is really training Mahmoud Abbas's, which is not Mahmoud Abbas's, it is the Palestinian National Authority security forces. If it is training it, I don't think they will be such public about it. If they mean to strengthen a party at the expense of another, they would be extremely discreet. Every single day there is a report coming from Washington that we are paying $86 million, that we are training that guard, that we are equipping that force. And I think it is aimed exactly at what you believe is the opposite. It is aimed at delegitimizing the Palestinian national movement, because I do believe that for Israel and perhaps for America, the national movement has to be killed.
Well, training may be a fantasy, but arms supply seems to be a reality.
There is no evidence of that whatsoever.
Fair enough. We can deny it on the record then. Rada, you're last to sum up before we go to questions from the audience.
Okay. Let me just try and perhaps trace how we've got to here as quickly as I can. First of all, the fact that there is some internecine fighting in the Palestinian areas is entirely, in my view, entirely inevitable and predictable. And the really amazing thing is that it hasn't happened sooner. because what you have to remember is that the forces working to divide the Palestinians have been active for a long time. So it's not really the last 10 weeks we have to look at. It's only an exacerbation of a situation which has been growing. But you have to remember that first, Israel tried by supporting Hamas in its struggle against, or in order to build it up against the PLO in 1989, in the late 1980s, was a bid to divide and rule. Secondly, it won't surprise you in this order to know that I lay the blame entirely on the Israeli occupation and those Western powers that support Israel, entirely. This is not to say, Martin, that the Palestinians have no internal disagreements, that they don't fight, that they don't quarrel. They do. And the proof of the fact that this is all due to the occupation is that we have not had a civil war or an incipient civil war until now, because the Palestinians' capacity for reconciliation is really very striking. You think about it. So if you realize, or if you look back and look at what the occupation has done, it has created, as all colonial occupations do, it's created a client class, which it did during the Oslo years. These are people who benefit from the Israeli occupation and as a result have a stake in not changing the status quo. And one of the things we are seeing now is the effects of this on partly the group that Azzam is talking about and others who don't want to give up these privileges, such as they are given to them by Israel, and therefore there is that sort of, in that sense, that struggle for power. If you add to that the fact that the Oslo agreement, because it failed, the Palestinians voted in people whom they saw as less corrupt because of this elite group I was talking about, which Israel, the Israeli occupation, nurtured and you know, for its own purposes. Because they rejected that and they brought in this other group, you can see the siege that has been imposed on the Palestinian people. And it's easy to just talk about this if it's just one of those statistics. It is actually absolutely ferocious. The siege on the Palestinians is ferocious, and the closures on the Palestinian areas are unbelievable. Therefore, what I'm asking people to imagine here is a situation in which you have little enclaves, little hothouses of starving, unemployed people festering, who cannot come out from their areas to go anywhere, who have no means of having a normal life. All you need in such an explosive situation is a match, and then, you know, you've got it. And finally, Martin, the role of the arming of Mahmoud Abbas and this absolutely despicable policy which Israel and the Western powers and the European Union, which should be ashamed to actually go along with these despicable policies, is to actually destroy the Palestinian people by setting up one group against the other. Now, it's not, I don't know how successful they've been in arming and in getting these groups, but the attempt is quite obvious, it's quite clear, is to get a faction, this hated faction around Abbas, these same people who, as I said, were brought up as a client class, or some of them, not all of them, against the other faction, thus increasing the tensions, thus increasing the tendency or the move towards a civil war. And then you've got it. So therefore, finally, with the quartet meeting which you actually asked about, I cannot think of anything more sorry to use it, but despicable than this so-called peace process, which is just a hollow phrase, and the quartet, which is a disgraceful set of undertakers who only turn up to look at the dead body because they do nothing else. And these motions are entirely motivated by the new US policy towards the Middle East region, which is to divide it into moderates and extremists, and we mustn't forget about the assault on Iran, which is going to come soon, and I think this is all linked with that.
Thank you, Rada. Very passionate and convincing final word in the formal part of the proceedings. picture of a degree of unity achieved and maintained despite recent events in the face of enormous pressures and maneuvers. So now it's open for questions. When you ask a question, say who you are and where you're from, if that's relevant. And if you want to direct it to a particular member of the panel, say that. And so please, perhaps I'll begin with you since you're right in front of me. Wait for the microphone and don't do what I do, which is to let...
I belong to a group called Peace Now UK, which is a bit ironic. I want to ask the group, how do you negotiate with Israel? Because I get emails virtually every week from an organisation called Settlers Watch, which says that roads are being built and the settlements are being expanded, outposts which are illegal are still there, etc., etc., etc. So on the one hand, the government is saying, yes, we would like peace. But on the other hand, actually, in fact, like you're saying, all these settlements and roads are growing and Palestinians must see this and live with it. So how do you negotiate with a country which is, as far as I can see, hypocritical?
Most fundamental question. Well, I think perhaps just one panelist will answer that because we've probably got a few questions. David.
Well, in a nutshell, with tremendous difficulty. I think history has shown that the Israelis, are tough in terms of negotiations. I mean, I think one of the things we haven't touched on here, which relates to your question, is the current climate, political climate within Israel itself at the moment. I think, there's a lot of, for what it's worth, soul-searching going on within Israel at the moment post the Lebanon war. This is a country which really got a bit of a bloody nose in Lebanon. I covered the month-long, I think the longest month that the Israeli press referred to. I covered that conflict in the south of Lebanon. And, Israel is still smarting from that. On top of that, you have phenomenal political problems. I mean, the pressures currently with the resignation of the chief of staff, the allegations against Olmert himself. It's a country which is riven with problems at the moment. The idea that they are capable, particularly at this juncture, of putting in train any sort of negotiation policy or dialogue is frankly, I think, would be wishful thinking. That's over and above the fact that they are difficult to negotiate with anyway. As we've heard tonight, I mean, the siege of the Palestinian people is phenomenal. I mean, Gaza remains an open prison. I am constantly staggered when I go back there, time and again, just how bad conditions are and how much worse it can get. The Israelis at the moment, I don't think, are either in a position to negotiate or indeed are interested in negotiating. There's lots of proxies working on their behalf at the moment that they are very cleverly manipulating to ensure that they gain leverage.
Thank you, David. Another question? Well, over here, gentleman in the blue shirt.
Alan Batty. Can I ask two questions? One to the panel as a whole, and that is, what is Mahmoud Abbas's personal position? Can anybody explain what that is? He comes over in the press as being almost an American puppet, but I'm sure he isn't. But what is his position? And the second question is, the Americans put a lot of stress on Hamas accepting Israel's right to exist. Why is that so important to them? There are many countries in the world that don't accept Israel's existence, including the Saudis. Why is it important to them that Hamas accepts it?
Maybe one for you, Azzam. Two for you.
Well, Mahmoud Abbas is a pragmatist realist. That's what he is. He's not a dreamer. And people who are under occupation need dreamers. They don't need realists. Realists and pragmatists kill the project of liberation. You want people who dream of liberation, of freedom, of independence. No matter how long it takes. The Vietnamese would not have liberated themselves had they not been dreamers. Had Nelson Mandela not been a dreamer in his prison cell, the people of South Africa would never have made it. So, in a nutshell, that's what he is, and that's why he cannot take the Palestinian people to liberation and freedom. The second point about why Israel and the rest of the world want Hamas to recognize Israel, it's simply a blackmail. It's blackmail. How the hell do the Israelis want me to recognize their existence on my father's land? You tell me. Just by pure common sense. Somebody comes, takes your land, drives you out and says, recognize I am illegitimate. You are bloody not legitimate. That's it. The Israelis as a state, as an entity, have no right to exist on my father's land in my mother's house. But the Jews who today live in Israel can live with me as neighbors. We can live together. And this is what the Israelis have to come to accept and recognize. As a people, they can live with us. As a state, as an entity, it has a deadline, and the deadline is approaching soon.
All right, I think I must pass these two questions to you, Sam, also.
You have to? You see, sometimes we distance ourselves from history. And we sound as if Israel has only started recently doing what it is doing now. As if Israel has started asking Hamas for recognition, and only Hamas. And before that it was really in bed with the Fatah leaders. No, it wasn't, my friend. First of all, let us remember, again, history is very important. And this is a very living history, only a few years ago, that Arafat was the one who took the decision to end the peace process. After he realized that the previous 10 years have been lies. He terminated it. He went back home. It wasn't Hamas who started the Intifada. It was somebody else. It's on record, so I can't spell it out. This is number one. Number two, Israel has always derailed any attempt for a peaceful resolution by always rendering any Palestinian political representation irrelevant. It did that with Yasser Arafat. It besieged him. Did we forget that they besieged him? Did we forget that they killed him, actually? Did we? The second thing.
Can I carry on, but can I steer you to the 2 points?
It's very important. This point will lead us to the present time. Because if we analyze everything in isolation of what happened, as if everything started on the 25th of January 2006, this is a very long struggle of more than 60 years, my friend. And we have, the entire Palestinian lot, have to start from where others ended. We can't just have started from square zero. If you want me to jump that process and get to the main question that you wanted me to ask, I think Israel is using this whole Hamas recognition as only an excuse not to engage in a political process. Absolutely so. And there is no doubt about it. Having said that, I think Hamas has a very important point, that our brothers in Fatah, or parts of Fatah, have tried that path, and it failed. Number one. Number two, Hamas has a point in saying that let Israel recognize itself first. Let Israel tell us what are its borders, and we shall consider it.
Fair enough. Can I ask one quick supplementary of Azzam in a follow-up to his response? I mean, the outside world, I think, does not see a huge difference now between the position that Israel is to be recognized as a state and what I take to be Hamas' position that Israel is to be recognized as a reality for the time being, and the time being may last a generation or more, and at some point in the future another generation will make some final decisions about these matters, another generation of both Israelis and Palestinians. The outside world doesn't see much difference. The Israelis choose to see a huge difference, so do the Americans. I'm not sure how that sits with your very passionate statement about the recognition of Israel as a reality that exists and is likely to exist for a long time, and that might ultimately be recognized as a reality. Not the legitimacy of the foundation of the state, but the legitimacy of the state as it is. You will excuse me if I'm using words which are problematic, but can you speak to that briefly?
That's why the best that Hamas can offer on this issue is a long-term truce, because that would be in line with the legitimate rights of the Palestinians and in loyalty to the 4 million or more who live in the diaspora or in refugee camps and who have the right to return. but also as a step toward a better future in which we can all live together, where there is no apartheid state anymore. You see, the blindness with the West is that they don't see that Israel is the remaining apartheid state on the face of the globe. So instead of having a state for the Jews, which no democratic person would recognize as acceptable between him or herself, let's have one entity in which we can all live in peace. And we, the Muslims, never had problems with the Jews before. Yeah. The conflict is not between the Muslims and the Jews, and therefore we can live together again in peace. And I think the long-term truce is the best mechanism to get there sometime in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Just very quickly, because I think really this is an important question about Israel's right to exist, which is plagued, I mean, we've seen a lot about it, so it's a very good question. I just want to say this. There is a difference between recognizing states de facto and recognizing them de jure. And actually Hamas, I think, has made it absolutely clear that it will deal with Israel de facto, which is why it talks about a truce, but it's a very different matter to recognize it de jure, not only for all the reasons my colleagues have brought up, but because if you think about it, it's like rubbing the Palestinians' nose in it. It's one thing to say you must recognize us, but it's another to say our right to exist. It is rubbing their noses in it, really.
Point taken.
Hello, my name is Lindy Saville. I'd actually like to say the summer before Sharon moved into Al-Aqsa, I actually took that window of opportunity to go to Jerusalem. I was actually recceing a film I wanted to make on who is Jesus through Judaism, Christianity and Islam. And but we went, my son and I, who was 15, really as tourists, and just took a little digital camera. But it was really quite shocking how we were observed and watched, and even our car number was noted when we got back to the airport. And as I said, we actually were too terrified to take any digital film that wasn't actual just tourist pictures, but we did our recce with our eyes. And it really is quite remarkable that there isn't any kind of governing situation in Palestine, because it's miraculous that anybody could garner together any kind of system, because it is so incredibly horrific, the Israeli control of the area. And I mean, people now talk about, it's like saying to children in the playground, no, you can't have the playground, no, you've got to be barricaded in your classrooms, no, you can't have the light of day, you can't go back, no, you can't go over to the school across the road, no, you can't do any of those things, but we want you to have a nice little organized conversation, how you're going to work everything out and be friends. I mean, it is extreme, but I would like to say as well that since it is a miracle already that there is any kind of discussions, that both sides that have now emerged under this stress should consider that when the West talks about the Middle East, it still makes the mistake of when they say, oh, someone said Allahu Akbar before whatever or whatever, they translate it as God is great. Actually, it doesn't mean God is great. It is the comparative. It is God is greater. Greater than anybody. Whether the pious person in their prayer, the moment they put their head on the floor, they actually say that. God is greater than this thought that I'm having, that I think I'm praying. Or before, I think that I can take things into my own hands. Yeah. God is actually greater. I'm sorry, nobody wants to sort of, you want to stop me because you don't want me to have a spiritual interpretation of this.
You misunderstand.
But, no, I don't misunderstand. I think it's very true. Both sides should consider that. And be a little more, they have to be a little more surrendered to the other side, and maybe think of the way that Gandhi approached the problem in India and so on. And they have to be, because the other side is so ferocious, they have to be sweeter.
Please don't think I'm
No,
in any
because
way.
because
please don't think I'm in any way demoting what you've just said. I think it's very cogent and very reasonable contribution, and you're coming at it from a different angle. And
yes, which is what I wanted to.
Yeah, but thank you very much.
I wasn't asking a question other than possibly you could consider that, because also people do not realize. No, they don't. They don't realize we only the question.
We either need a question. I think you've made a statement, and thank you very much.
Martin, can I just pick up something? Just an interesting, just on that, on a point there. I mean, you mentioned Gandhi, for example, and I think, again, as an outsider, it's something that I've written about quite a bit of late. There have been a lot of stress put on the idea of how does the Palestinian movement, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, be it Fatah, be it Hamas or whatever, how do they start readdressing the resistance to the occupation itself? There's been much talk of a kind of Gandhi-esque notion of turning the other cheek, of actually engaging civil disobedience and resistance or whatever. Part of the problem with that, of course, is that Israel has shown time and again that if you turn the other cheek, they're quite happy to smack the other one even harder. I think that's to be realistic and pragmatic about it, that's the case. But I do think it's a valid issue. It's something that has been lost within the movement as a whole. We heard about the need for dreamers as well as realist pragmatists. And I think that is desperately needed within the Palestinian movement at the moment.
David, thanks very much. I think we'll take a few questions in a bunch because we're getting towards the end.
It's going to take 2.5 minutes. Actually, I've lived all my life in Palestine, and maybe it's very interesting to say it on the platform. I've lived all my life and I've never had a chance to meet any Israeli, and I don't think much of us had any chance to meet any Israeli, and I think that's where the problem lies. And the main responsible for that is the Israeli government itself. I used to study curriculum in a school which been given to us by or approved by the Israeli government, in which I've never ever read about the Holocaust. So it's just in years when I came to London I started really reading about the Holocaust and the horrible Second World War. And bear in mind I've lived in a village in Palestine, and the curriculum and the only information that came to us through the school, because we're not even allowed to have electricity in our village or have a radio station or television, so the only information that we get from the school, and it's totally controlled by Israel, and we've been designed, so that's what I call it, designing generation. We've been designed to not know anything so they can deal us in that certain way. The other thing is, this morning we just had a horrible statistics from Israel itself that the settlements are expanding. There's a new tunnel under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and actually I've got today a secret filming from the under Al-Aqsa Mosque saying there is a whole museum and synagogue called the New Generation City, and you can see a big synagogue built under the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I don't know how surprising this news will be when it comes to TV. Secondly, just talking about Mahmoud Abbas, I think he's a yo-yo game or whatever, because when he was Prime Minister, American and European wanted to swap power from Yasser Arafat, the great leader, to him. And when he became president, they don't want the government or the Prime Minister to have power, so they want to swap it to him. So it's basically yo-yo, to do with whatever. My question is about money and siege, and is it illegal actually to stop what's so-called aid to the Palestinians or not? Because as far as I'm concerned, it's not aid. It's an entire obligation for the occupying forces to be responsible for the people who've been, set under occupation, and it's an illegal action to be taken by the European and American. Is that legal or legal?
Okay, we'll get into that later. The lady in the green at the back.
Good evening. Ryder spoke about the traumatic influence that of all the killings, the war-torn situation in Palestine, and coming from South Africa under imperial law or governance, I fully have total empathy with the Palestinian situation. My question to the panel, though, which was not addressed, the surrounding Arab states have failed in their condemnation, I feel, of Israel. They failed in their condemnation of the barbaric execution of Saddam Hussein. They failed in their condemnation of the attack on Lebanon, etc., etc.
Thanks very much. Over here. And say who you are and so on.
My name is Rupani. I come from India, and I know the freedom struggle and Gandhi and other things we're talking about. But I think there is some sort of fixation by the Americans and British and European that theocratic state can be bad. It is a sense, it is an evolutionary process. It takes time, you see, and preventing, say, a religious state in Jordan or in Egypt, for instance, there is a pent-up demand. But what I also can't understand, for 60 years I've been observing Palestinian struggle, and they are so inept, Palestinian I say, and so foolish that they fight among themselves while Israel is arming itself, both by the Britain and by America, in such a way.
Good point. Gentleman here.
I'd like to address this to Mr. Tamimi. I really agree with you, this utopian vision that you describe, Balad Wahed Hukuk Mutasawi, one country with equal rights. And that really is the omega point towards which ultimately we must be heading, because the structures that make up Israel are clearly insane, and ultimately they will crumble. They have to. It may not be in the next 10 years, the next 100 years, but it will be in the next 1,000 years, inshallah. But what I'm saying is that what you've described is then a state of brotherhood, one land with equal rights for all. So you must drop the Islamist sobriquet.
Thank you very much. A couple more and then we'll ask to sum up. This gentleman here.
My name is Moshe Markover. I'm an Israeli anti-Zionist. Martin, you started the whole discussion with the premise that both sides in this present conflict are heading towards one goal, and that is the creation of a Palestinian state. I'm wondering how realistic this is. Is a viable Palestinian state at all a realistic possibility in the present circumstances? I've looked at the statistics of Israeli colonization of the West Bank, which proceeded without any interruption, relentless, during the Oslo period and during the Camp David. Given all the actual facts on the ground, how realistic is the prospect of a viable Palestinian state, as opposed to a series of Indian reservations?
Fine, okay. Well, just one more question and then one more. I think. Oh, sorry, I caught my eye first.
I'd just like to...
Please, your name and...
my name's Pauline Macmillan. I'd like to invite my Glaswegian friend, if he believes in non-violent resistance, to visit the Bedouin in the Negev, because they do not resist, and you should see the state that they're living in.
Well, okay. As I said a moment ago, I'm not necessarily advocating non-violent resistance. I think there is an element of the Palestinian movement that needs to revisit aspects of civil disobedience as a nature of resistance to the occupation. But I think it would be naive in the extreme to imagine that somehow that singularly will make any real inroads in terms of resisting the occupation or changing Israeli policy.
Okay, well, now we come to a possibility for everybody in the panel to say some final words. There's 6 or 7 questions there. You can touch on them if you wish, or just say what you think is most relevant at the end of the discussions. They included whether or not suspending funding is illegal, a much more, a very fundamental question from Oishi about the question of whether it's even conceivable that a viable Palestinian state, never mind the more distant aspirations, is a possibility at this moment or likely to become a possibility in the near future. A hard and pessimistic question. So I put it to you in sequence, and I'll begin with Azzam.
Well, let me start with the aid issue. Osama, any country has a sovereign right to stop giving aid to a third party, to another country. It does have that right. What it doesn't have, however, is this thuggish approach to stop other money from other countries arriving to that third party, as in Washington imposing that extreme mafia-style siege around Palestine, preventing Arab money, legitimate Arab League money, arriving to Palestine. That is absolutely a war crime. Having said that, let me talk about the viability of the Palestinian state. I do think, my friend, that yes, Israel has made absolutely sure that the two-state solution is no longer there. We as Palestinians on the land are viable because we belong to a region. We have a region that it is our depth. We belong to the land. We have sovereignty, by the way. We are denied to exercise that sovereignty, but we own it. The question mark is not next to Palestine. It is certainly next to Israel. And it is next to Israel as a Jewish state, and I do not think it's going to take 1,000 years for that question mark to be resolved. It's going to take much less, by maximum 50 years. How do you establish a purist, exclusive society and want to have democracy? You can't. Now, Israel has already made up its mind. Their leaders, the establishment, has come up to the conclusion that they can't. And the only way is to manage the conflict, not resolve it. And settlement exercise, the enterprise of settlement, has to be seen from that angle, in that context, that we need to manage the conflict. Because if they give us a Palestinian independent sovereign state, then they haven't solved their problem. They are still left with one of each 4 Israelis who are Palestinians. And they still think that in 20 years there will be half Palestinians, half Israelis, without the return of one refugee. The crux of the matter here is not only that of occupation. It is that of ideas, it is that of ideology. And I do believe passionately that the only start for ending seriously this conflict is revisiting Zionism. It cannot accommodate us. I assure you that Zionism will not be able to accommodate a Palestinian state, a Palestinian citizen, a Palestinian existence, a Palestinian identity for that matter. The way forward is to revisit these exclusive identities. And the very last thing I really want to say is what David said. I think it is high time for us, having been over the period of hangover of the peace process, the last 5 years it was a hangover of the peace process, to sit around one table and to think about one thing, and one thing only. How do we, as Palestinians, with the help of the international community, make the occupation less comfortable?
Good point. Azzam, will you go next?
Yeah, I'd like to address 2 points. The first is to do with the state. You see, the Palestinian struggle originally was never really about a state. And the Palestinian struggle started faltering when the state issue came up. Palestine was never a state on its own. And I, as a Palestinian, I don't give a damn whether it is a Palestinian state or the Federal Republic of the Middle East that I am part of. I want my freedom. I want my dignity as a human being. These Zionists came from Europe and dehumanized me. That's the problem. That's the root of the problem. I need to address this problem. And then we can talk about what state. And neither Israel nor a Palestinian state next to it is viable. They continue to live on America, on Europe, on money coming from outside. It's a useless exercise to think about these mini states that continue to be satellites within this unjust global order. The question of Islam and Hamas. See, there's a problem with concepts here, the problem with the use of concepts and terms. Secularism in the West is usually associated with freedom, with democracy, with all the nice things. Secularism in the Arab world is associated with the exact opposite. It's associated with corruption, it's associated with despotism, with autocracy. Look at the autocratic governments in the region. They're all secular. They've been always secular. Saudi Arabia is secular. Saudi Arabia is secular. It's using Islam. Saudi Arabia is the most secular regime in the region, by the way. But nevertheless, this is not the issue. The issue here is that for Hamas in particular, if you think of it in the way as a theocratic organization or a group, then you will never be able to assess it correctly or understand it. Islam to Hamas and to other liberation movements and reform movements in the region is not medieval Christianity to Europe. And we don't have time to talk a lot about this, but that is where we have to make the distinction. When we talk about Islam in Hamas, we mean Jew, Christian, Muslim, whatever religion, you are equally dignified in the eyes of the law as in the eyes of God. That's what it means.
Thank you. Rada, people talking about the long-term lack of viability of either an Israeli state or a Palestinian state. Maybe. I'm reminded, though, of the phrase that history is lived forward but understood backward. And I'm chary of these kind of predictions. And I would ask both you and David, who will speak next, to address the question of, okay, maybe this will be the situation in 40 or 50 years, but what do we do now? because it seems to me it's not much good arguing, certainly from a practical point of view, about what's going to happen in half a century when you have immediate problems on your doorstep.
Yeah. Yes, what do we do now? Well, if the question is addressed to Palestinians, then I think their choices are quite limited. And the most fundamental and important thing they can do is to stay on their land. Because Israel is doing everything it can to expel them. Now, the real heart of the struggle has to be to stay. So any agency or person or institution that can assist the Palestinians to stay so that they're not starved into leaving or bombed into leaving would be the right way forward. And I do want to say very quickly something about the question of resistance, and I think you talked about ineptitude and so on. Actually, this is a terribly important subject. The question really is not only just how should the Palestinians resist, because it's also tied in with the question of staying on their land. It's part of it. But really, the world has to decide what is the distinction between legitimate resistance and terrorism. Because it seems to me that distinction has now disappeared from the political dictionary. And when you apply to the Palestinians, everything they do is terrorism, having forgotten that people who are occupied and oppressed have the right, the international legal right, to resist occupation. It's certainly true that the Palestinians need to sit down and work out a unified strategy about resisting Israel and Israel's attempts to expel them. And I am not a believer in the school of non-violent resistance, civil disobedience. This has been tried. And as my friend here said, David, if you're dealing with Israel, it doesn't work like that. They will simply kill you rather more easily than if you stood up to them. Finally, I can't help but say something, Martin, about the question of the one state, because not to speak of the fact that my forthcoming book is about this subject, but because quite genuinely, I really cannot see a way forward. Moshe is absolutely right. There is no possibility of a Palestinian state, and I wish people would stop talking about a Palestinian state and the two-state solution, because it's not going to happen. Why? And because it's not going to happen, what will be the alternative? Willy-nilly, either through managed process or willy-nilly by chaos and violence and so on and bloodshed, we will end up with the territory occupied by those two peoples in a one-state situation. And I hope, to our friend here, certainly not in 1,000 years, I hope within my own lifetime, and I don't intend to live to be 150.
Thank you, Radha. David, you've got the task of bringing the discussion. No future for two states?
Well, I actually fully agree with what Radha just said with regards to the question of the state issue. I wouldn't disagree with any of that at all. I mean, far be it from me to tell the Palestinians what's good for them, what's bad. That's part of the problem. People have been telling the Palestinians what's good and bad for them for centuries, almost for decades, certainly. Not that necessarily the advice is always bad or irrelevant. And in that respect, I think the Palestinians, as an outsider, I'm not Palestinian. I go there, I look at the situation, I observe, I write about it. I think it's high time the Palestinians have to take responsibility themselves. I go back to the theme of this evening, this question of an internal battle. These are perilous times. I'm sure my colleagues would agree with this. The worst possible scenario is for Palestinian to fight Palestinian in this situation. They must stop burying the hatchet in each other's back, sit round the table and come up with some kind of strategy against the occupation. Much has often been made about the distinction of the two intifadas, the War of the Stones, the first intifada of 87, the civil disobedience that was involved then. I think Marwan Barghouti once made a comment about how it changed with the result of the Al-Aqsa intifada, the arming of the militias, and how the world began to look at the resistance differently. I think that is a crux issue here. It's high time the Palestinians really came up with a strategy of getting the world back on their side, and they will not do that by fighting each other.
Thank you very much, David. Bury the hatchet and get the world to take a fresh look at Palestinians under occupation. It wasn't, but I think we have to pass on now and declare the discussions over. And could we have a round of applause for these excellent speakers?